A young child's voice pierced through an expensive London showroom filled with millionaires and art experts, speaking perfect Italian as she declared that a $300 million painting was nothing more than an elaborate hoax. 4 simple words escaped her lips and instantly froze an auction worth more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. The girl wasn't meant to speak, wasn't even supposed to be standing in that room, yet she noticed something that every wealthy collector and trained professional had completely missed. A single flaw buried underneath layers of aged paint and decades of carefully constructed lies. When a furious bidder demanded to know who she thought she was to make such an accusation, her response was devastatingly simple and completely unshakable. She was someone who recognized authenticity when she saw it. What started as the most anticipated art sale in modern history rapidly transformed into a scandal that would shake the foundations of the global art market. This is how one Maid's daughter, armed with nothing but inherited wisdom and courage beyond her years, exposed a forgery so sophisticated it had fooled the world's leading experts and prevented the greatest art fraud of our generation. Now, before we go any further into this incredible journey, I need you to do something for me. If this story already has you curious about what happens next, go ahead and smash that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this goes. And hitting subscribe ensures you'll catch every twist and turn of stories like this. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching this from, because I genuinely love seeing how these stories reach people across the globe. All right, let's dive into what really happened that day. Her great-grandfather had once told her something she never forgot, that art itself never deceives, but people absolutely do. The young girl remained motionless toward the rear of the magnificent auction hall, trying to be invisible in a universe of unimaginable wealth. Her mother had given her clear instructions to blend into the background, and 10-year-old Clara was doing everything in her power to follow those orders. The atmosphere inside the Ellington auction house felt different from normal air. It carried weight and density, perfumed with costly fragrances, inherited fortunes, and the unmistakable electric charge of pure greed. Enormous crystal chandeliers cast light that bounced off diamond jewelry and the polished edges of champagne flutes. Gentlemen dressed in perfectly fitted suits conversed in subdued, important tones, their voices reminiscent of paper currency being counted. Ladies whose faces had been surgically tightened and smoothed positioned themselves like refined sculptures, their gazes constantly evaluating everyone's wealth and social standing with well-practiced precision. Clara Miller occupied a small recessed area near the service door, clutching a weathered leather journal against her chest. The journal's pages contained the graceful, flowing handwriting of her great-grandfather, Sergeant Jack Miller. That journal represented her sole source of comfort in this environment of cold stone and even colder stairs. Her modest blue dress was spotless but clearly worn from countless washings. Her blonde hair, pale as wheat straw, was pulled back with an unpretentious ribbon. She understood with the absolute certainty that only a child possesses that this was not her world. Her mother, Sarah, navigated through the crowd's periphery with a rehearsed quietness that stood in stark contrast to the attendees' carefully cultivated poise. Sarah's silence came from necessity, from an entire lifetime spent moving through wealthy people's spaces without creating any disturbance. She carried a small container of auction catalogs for her employer, her expression maintained as a careful mask of courteous efficiency. However, Clara, who understood her mother's expressions better than any textbook, could detect the thin lines of concern around her eyes. She noticed how her mother's hands, typically so controlled, shook ever so slightly as she extended a catalog to a passing guest who accepted it without acknowledgement or even a glance. Their presence in this room traced back to Mr. Arthur Pendleton. He was a billionaire from America, an elderly gentleman with a neatly groomed gray beard and eyes that appeared to hold perpetual sadness. He occupied a seat in the front row, a figure representing enormous influence yet appearing utterly isolated. He hadn't smiled even once since losing his wife Eleanor exactly 1 year earlier. A profound stillness had descended upon him. Eleanor had been the one with genuine passion for artistic expression. She had transformed their New York penthouse into a space filled with beauty and illumination. Arthur had simply covered the expenses. Now consumed by grief, he had made the decision to honor her memory by obtaining the one piece she had eternally dreamed about, the one that had existed only as legend until 3 months prior. The reason for this entire gathering, the source of electric tension saturating the room, was positioned on a velvet-covered easel on the primary stage. The painting carried the title La Dama Silenziosa, which translates to the Silent Lady. It was being presented as a lost masterpiece, a recently discovered portrait attributed to the greatest master who ever lived, Leonardo da Vinci himself. The woman portrayed in the artwork was stunning, with a mysterious smile already being compared to the famous Mona Lisa. Her eyes appeared to contain a secret, and the soft, hazy blending of illumination and darkness, that renowned technique, was executed so masterfully it literally took your breath away. The art world had erupted in excitement. Museums had competed fiercely for it. Critics had composed glowing analyses about its flawless composition, its heavenly beauty. Its projected value stood at $300 million. Clara studied the painting and something didn't feel right. She had invested hundreds of hours examining prints in her great-grandfather's books. He had been far more than a soldier. He had served as one of the Monuments Men, belonging to the specialized unit that rescued artwork stolen by the Nazis throughout World War II. He had taught her how to examine art not merely as an attractive image, but as an object possessing history, a narrative told through canvas, pigment, and wood. Search for the artist's touch, Clara, he had written in his journal, not simply his signature. Search for his errors, his adjustments, his essence. That's where authenticity lives. The auction commenced. The auctioneer, a gentleman with a polished, mesmerizing voice, initiated the bidding at a staggering $100 million. The bids climbed immediately, jumping in $10 million increments. A Russian oligarch, a Saudi prince, a technology billionaire from California. The figures grew so massive they stopped making sense to Clara. They became just sounds, a rhythm of wealth reverberating in the towering ceiling room. Mr. Pendleton remained completely motionless, his hand never moving. He was waiting, his attention fixed on the painting. He was attempting to purchase back a fragment of his wife's soul. The bidding decelerated at $270 million. The room became quiet, the atmosphere crackling with expectation. $270 million bid by the gentleman on the telephone. The auctioneer announced, his voice flowing smooth as silk. Do I hear 280? The room fell silent. Mr. Pendleton gradually raised his paddle. $280 million, the auctioneer proclaimed, his voice resonating with victory. A new bid from Mr. Arthur Pendleton. The gentleman on the platform who had presented the painting, an attractive silver-haired art dealer named Julian Croft, gave Mr. Pendleton a dazzling, self-assured smile. Croft had discovered the painting, negotiated the transaction, and his reputation was about to be established as legendary in the art world. He moved with the effortless grace of someone who owned the very oxygen in the room. He had spoken to Mr. Pendleton earlier, his voice rich and comforting, but when his eyes had passed over Sarah and Clara, his smile had tightened into something harsh and disagreeable. A brief flicker of irritation that they were even breathing the same air. $280 million going once, the auctioneer called out. The other bidders had withdrawn. The room held its collective breath. Mr. Pendleton was moments away from making the most expensive art acquisition in contemporary history. Clara looked at the painting again. The woman's face seemed too flawless. The shadows were beautiful, but they felt shallow. She squinted, attempting to see what her great-grandfather would have noticed. Her eyes scanned the dark background, the folds of the lady's velvet dress, the gentle curve of her hand. The details were all present, all the elements the experts celebrated, but they felt like a recipe's ingredient list, not a completed dish. It was a perfect replica of a soul, but the actual soul was absent. A knot of anxiety tightened in Clara's stomach. Everyone was being deceived. Mr. Croft's smile resembled that of a predator who had trapped his victim. She observed Mr. Pendleton, his face carved with grief so intense he was prepared to pay any amount to ease it. She thought of her mother's exhausted face, of the dismissive look from Mr. Croft. Her great-grandfather's words resonated in her mind from a passage she had read just that morning. Truth possesses a quiet voice, little star, but it becomes the loudest sound in a room filled with lies. Going twice, the auctioneer's voice thundered. She needed to do something, but what? She was merely a child, the maid's daughter. Who would possibly take her seriously? She took a small step forward from the recessed area. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She opened her mouth, but only a tiny squeak emerged. Nobody heard. Sold, the auctioneer shouted, his gavel raised high, about to descend, for $280 million. The finality of that word, The sight of the descending gavel shattered through her fear. In that split second, she didn't consider the consequences, didn't think about her mother's employment, didn't worry about the fury of powerful people. She only thought about the deception, the enormous $300 million lie about to be hammered into history as truth. She inhaled deeply and spoke, not in English but in the beautiful, formal Italian her great-grandfather had taught her, the language of the Renaissance itself. Her voice, though not loud, was shockingly clear and unwavering in the tense silence. It sliced through the perfumed air like broken glass. Quel dipinto è un falso? The room became utterly, profoundly motionless. The auctioneer's gavel stopped, suspended in midair, a centimeter from the podium. Every head in the front rows, heads belonging to some of the planet's most powerful individuals, snapped in her direction. Julian Croft's victorious smile disappeared, replaced by a flash of absolute panic before he could disguise it with outrage. Sarah froze, the container of catalogs slipping from her numb fingers and scattering across the marble floor. She stared at her daughter as though she were a stranger. She had no idea Clara could speak a single word of Italian, but Arthur Pendleton understood perfectly. He had spent years traveling to Florence and Milan with his wife. The words were unmistakable. That painting is a fake. His head, which had been bowed slightly, slowly lifted. His sad, weary eyes widened, first in disbelief and then with a dawning intense focus. He turned in his seat and stared at the small, blonde-haired American girl in the faded blue dress. He looked at her as though he were seeing her for the very first time. The entire transaction, the culmination of months of preparation and hundreds of millions of dollars, hung suspended in the air, held there by the quiet, impossible words of a 10-year-old girl. The silence stretched thick and heavy with disbelief. Then a low murmur rippled through the crowd as people translated the strange moment for their neighbors. Julian Croft was the first to recover his voice. He released a short, forced laugh that sounded more like a bark. A prank, he announced, his voice slightly too loud, slightly too sharp. Some sort of childish prank. Security! He gestured vaguely toward the back of the room. Please remove the woman and her disruptive child. This is a house of business, not a playground. Two large security guards in black suits began moving purposefully from the main doors toward the recessed area. Sarah rushed forward, her face white with fear and humiliation. I'm so sorry, sir. So terribly sorry. Clara, what have you done? Come with me now. She grabbed her daughter's arm, her entire body trembling. This was a catastrophe. They would be terminated, blacklisted, all because Clara had spoken out of turn. The other collectors were muttering, shaking their heads in disgust. Unbelievable, the audacity. Get her out of here, but Clara didn't move. She held her ground, her small shoulders squared. She met the astonished gaze of Arthur Pendleton and spoke again, this time in English, her voice unwavering. I said the painting is a fake. She pointed a small, steady finger at the masterpiece on the stage. That whole thing is a lie. The confidence in her voice was staggering. It wasn't the petulance of a child throwing a tantrum. It was the calm conviction of an expert stating a fact. The room was now divided. On one side was Julian Croft sputtering with outrage and the audience looking confused and annoyed. On the other was the silent, calculating billionaire, and in the middle was Clara, a tiny island of defiance. This is outrageous, Croft boomed, his handsome face turning a blotchy red. Arthur, are you going to let a servant's brat scuttle the deal of a lifetime based on a childish fantasy? Tell the auctioneer to drop the gavel. Let's be done with this nonsense. Mr. Pendleton ignored him completely. His eyes were still locked on Clara. He saw the worn journal she clutched like a shield. He saw the complete absence of fear in her eyes. He saw something that made him pause, something that cut through the fog of his grief. In his world of deceit and flattery, of yes-men and sycophants, raw, unafraid honesty was a rare and precious commodity. Wait, Mr. Pendleton said softly. The two security guards who had almost reached Sarah stopped in their tracks. The auctioneer lowered his arm, placing the gavel silently on the podium. Every eye in the room was now on the American billionaire. What did you say, young lady? Arthur Pendleton asked, his voice calm but carrying immense authority. Croft's angry tirade died in his throat. He stared at Pendleton in disbelief. Arthur, don't be absurd. You can't possibly entertain this circus. She made an accusation that questions not only your honor, Mr. Croft, but my intelligence, Pendleton replied, his voice growing colder as he turned to the art dealer. In front of the entire world, she will have the chance to explain herself. He then looked back at Clara. "Bring the child here." One of Mr. Pendleton's personal assistants, a stern-looking man named Richard, stepped forward. He looked from his boss to Clara with a conflicted expression. He hesitated, then gave a slight nod. Sarah looked like she was about to faint. This was a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Her daughter was about to be publicly humiliated, and they were about to lose everything. Clara, however, walked forward. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. She walked with a strange, calm purpose. Her worn-out shoes made no sound on the plush crimson carpet. She walked past the rows of stunned billionaires and famous collectors, past the smirking face of Julian Croft, and stopped at the edge of the stage. She was so small that the great easel towered over her. "The floor is yours, little one," Mr. Pendleton said, his voice laced with heavy irony, though his eyes were sharp with genuine curiosity. Tell us all how you, a child, know more than the legion of experts and critics who have authenticated this masterpiece. Explain this lie." Clara took a breath, the scent of money and dust filling her lungs. She placed her great-grandfather's journal on the edge of the stage. Then she looked up at the painting of the silent lady. "You don't have to be old to see the truth," she began, her voice small but carrying in the profound silence. "You just have to know where to look." She pointed to the canvas. Real masterworks from the late 15th century, especially from Leonardo's workshop in Lombardy, were often painted on fine linen canvas with a specific herringbone weave. It was a local specialty. If you look closely at the texture, especially where the paint is thinnest in the background, she paused, looking directly at Mr. Pendleton. "This canvas has a simple tabby weave. It's good quality canvas, but it's the wrong kind. It was probably made in the 18th or 19th century and then aged with chemicals to make it look old." Julian Croft let out another scornful laugh. "Preposterous. She's been reading fairy tales." The provenance of the canvas was certified by the Delacroix Institute. Clara ignored him, her focus absolute. She pointed to the deep, rich blue of the lady's velvet gown. "And the paint," she continued. "The color is wrong. Leonardo was famous for his use of ultramarine made from grinding lapis lazuli stones. It's a very expensive, very specific pigment. Under a microscope, you can see the sharp crystalline structure of the groundstone. It reflects light in a unique way. This blue," she squinted, "is too smooth. It's too uniform. It looks like Prussian blue." A few quiet gasps came from a group of museum curators standing near the side of the room. "And what, my dear?" Croft asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is Prussian blue?" Clara finally turned her clear blue eyes on him. "It's a synthetic pigment," she said simply. "And it wasn't invented until 1706, more than 200 years after Leonardo da Vinci died." A heavy, shocked silence fell over the room. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was a powerful one. The curators were now whispering furiously amongst themselves. Mr. Pendleton leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his skepticism beginning to melt away, replaced by an intense, burning curiosity. "Impressive theories, little girl," Croft sneered, though a bead of sweat was now visible on his temple. "Did you learn that in your art class?" "I learned it from my great-grandfather," Clara said, tapping the journal. "He was Sergeant Jack Miller. He was part of the Monuments Men. He saved art from the Nazis. He was a hero. He knew more about history than anyone. He taught me that forgers are clever, but they're also arrogant. They always miss one small thing, one little detail that gives them away. But that's not the biggest mistake," Clara said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing them all in. "The biggest mistake is something you can't see. It's what's underneath." She looked at Mr. Pendleton. Leonardo was a perfectionist. He was always changing his mind. His paintings, when you look at them with a special camera, with infrared reflectography, are full of changes. They're called pentimenti. He would move a hand, change the angle of a head, adjust the fold of a sleeve. You can see the original drawings, the first ideas, right there under the paint. She turned and pointed at the painting one last time. "This painting is too perfect. I promise you, if you scanned it, you would find no changes. You would find a perfect, clean underdrawing. It's not the work of a master creating something new. It's the work of a copyist carefully tracing a finished design." Then she delivered the final devastating blow. "And the forger left his signature." "What are you talking about?" Croft demanded, his voice cracking. "There is no signature." "There is," Clara said softly. "You just don't know what you're looking for." She directed her words to Mr. Pendleton. In the dark background, just over her left shoulder, there's a tiny dragonfly painted into the shadows. It's almost invisible. The artist probably thought it was a clever touch, a little sign of life in the darkness. All eyes strained to see it. From a distance, it was impossible. That specific way of painting a dragonfly, Clara said, her voice filled with a cold certainty that chilled the room. With the two sets of wings slightly offset, was the secret signature of a man named Erich Hoffmann. He was a German art restorer who became one of the most famous forgers of the 20th century. He sold fakes to Hermann Göring and the Nazis. My great-grandfather investigated him after the war. He wrote all about it. He called the dragonfly Hoffmann's little mark of pride. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Whoever made this painting, she concluded, her voice soft but devastating, wasn't Leonardo da Vinci. It was someone who was copying the style of a Nazi-era forger. This isn't a Renaissance masterpiece. It's a fake of a fake. Silence. A deep, profound, and terrible silence filled the auction house. Julian Croft's face had gone from red to a sickly pale white. He looked at the painting, then at Clara, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. The investors and collectors who had been so eager moments before were now looking at him with dawning horror and suspicion. Arthur Pendleton sat back in his chair. He stared at the painting on the stage, the painting he had been moments away from buying, the foundation of a $300 million deal, and he saw it not as a link to his wife's memory, but as a cheap and clever forgery. He had been so blinded by grief, so desperate to reclaim a piece of the past that he had almost been made a fool in front of the entire world. He finally turned his gaze to Julian Croft. The sadness was gone from his eyes. It was replaced by a cold, hard fire. It was the look of a titan of industry who had just uncovered a traitor in his boardroom. "Richard," Mr. Pendleton said to his assistant, his voice dangerously quiet, "get Professor Davies from the CLLD Institute on a video call. Now. Use the secure line." Then he looked at the two security guards who stood frozen by the aisle. "And ensure Mr. Croft does not leave the room. I believe we have much to discuss." The air in the grand hall, once thick with anticipation, was now frozen with tension. The magnificent room had transformed from a theater of commerce into a courtroom. Julian Croft stood as if he'd been turned to stone, his suave demeanor shattered, leaving behind only the panicked look of a cornered animal. The collectors who had been his allies now looked at him with accusation, whispering furiously into their phones, their words filled with terms like fraud, lawsuit, and ruin. Sarah remained by the recessed area, her hand covering her mouth. Her fear for her job had been replaced by a dizzying mix of shock and a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Pride. She looked at her daughter, this small, quiet girl who had just faced down a room of the world's most powerful people, and saw not a child but a legacy. She saw her own grandfather, Jack Miller, a gentle, quiet man who possessed a will of iron and an unshakable devotion to the truth. She had thought those days, those stories were just part of their family's humble past. She never imagined they would erupt with such force in a London auction house. Within minutes, Richard returned with a laptop, which he placed on a small table in front of his boss. A large screen on the stage, which had earlier been showing glamorous shots of the painting, flickered to life. The face of an elderly, scholarly man with a white beard and kind, intelligent eyes appeared. He was in a library surrounded by towering shelves of old books. "Arthur," the professor said, his voice warm but professional, "it is late. I trust this is a matter of some importance." "It is, Alistair," Mr. Pendleton replied. He gestured for Richard to position the laptop's camera on the painting. "I need your eyes on something." Using the high-resolution camera, Richard focused on the artwork. He slowly panned across the canvas, zoomed in on the texture of the weave, and then on Mr. Pendleton's instruction, focused tightly on the deep blue of the dress and the shadowy background over the lady's left shoulder. On the large screen, the details Clara had described were magnified for everyone to see. The simple non-herringbone weave, the smooth, flat quality of the blue paint, and there, almost invisible but now glaringly obvious under the camera's zoom, was the tiny, delicately painted dragonfly. Professor Davies on the screen leaned closer to his own camera, his brow furrowed. He was silent for a long time, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Well, Alistair?" Mr. Pendleton prompted. The professor sighed, a soft, weary sound. "Arthur, where in God's name did you get this?" That is a question I will be exploring in great detail very shortly, Pendleton said, his eyes flicking for a moment to the sweating Julian Croft. First, tell me what you see. I see a very competent, very ambitious forgery, the professor said plainly. The artist is skilled, I will grant them that. The composition is a beautiful imitation of the Milan style of the 1490s, but it is an imitation, and a flawed one. Tell me about the flaws, Mr. Pendleton said, his gaze fixed on Croft. The pigment in the gown is the most obvious, of course, the professor explained, his voice that of a lecturer. Even through this camera, I can tell that is not lapis. It lacks the luminosity. It has the flat, opaque quality of a modern synthetic. Prussian blue is the most likely culprit, as the young lady suggested. But the truly damning detail, he paused, is that dragonfly. He let out a low whistle. That is the mark of Erich Hoffmann, a brilliant but corrupt technician. We have a file on him a foot thick. He specialized in creating lost masterpieces from the German and Italian schools. He would often use period-correct canvases and panels, but he cut corners on his pigments. He was arrogant. That dragonfly was his private joke. To find it on a painting being passed off as a Leonardo, my God, it's not just a fake, Arthur. It's an infamous fake. Or rather, a new work by a known forger's school of followers. This is an embarrassment of the highest order. The professor's final words echoed in the room. An embarrassment. The word was a death sentence for Julian Croft's career. He let out a strange, strangled noise, a sound of utter defeat. The auctioneer, looking ashen-faced, quietly announced that the auction was suspended pending a full investigation. Mr. Pendleton disconnected the video call with a nod to Richard. He sat for a moment in silence, the enormity of the situation washing over him, the betrayal, the near-catastrophic financial loss, the public humiliation he had so narrowly avoided. He looked at the circle of greedy, foolish men he had almost joined in error. He looked at the pale, trembling con man who had orchestrated the entire charade, and then his gaze fell on Clara. She was standing by the stage, her small face serious, her hand resting on her great-grandfather's journal. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't said, "I told you so." She had simply stated the truth and then stood by it, a small, unshakable pillar of integrity in a room built on lies. Mr. Pendleton rose slowly from his chair. He was a tall man, and his presence filled the room. The other men fell silent, watching him. He walked to the front, his steps measured and deliberate. He ignored Julian Croft. He walked right past the security guards. He stopped directly in front of Clara. Sarah held her breath. She didn't know what to expect. A dismissal, a thank you, a handful of money to make them go away. Mr. Pendleton looked down at Clara, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he did something that stunned everyone in the room. He bowed. It was not a shallow nod of the head. It was a deep, formal bow, a gesture of profound respect from a billionaire to a 10-year-old girl in a faded blue dress. "In my life," Arthur Pendleton said, his voice resonating with deep, newfound emotion, "I have been surrounded by advisors, experts, and men of great wealth. Today, my fortune and my late wife's honor were not saved by any of them. They were saved by a little girl with clear eyes and a hero for a great-grandfather." He straightened up and looked at Sarah. The polite mask of the employer was gone. He looked at her with genuine gratitude and respect. "Your daughter, madam, is an extraordinary person. You must be very proud." Sarah could only nod, her throat tight with emotion. Mr. Pendleton then turned to Richard, his voice once again steel. "Richard, please escort Mr. Croft to my private suite upstairs. Have security join him. Inform him that my lawyers will be there in 20 minutes. The rest of these gentlemen," he said with a sweep of his hand toward the other bidders, "are free to go." The game was over. Defeated and humiliated, Croft was led out of the room like a prisoner. The grand hall, a moment ago the center of the art world, quickly emptied, leaving only a smattering of auction house staff cleaning up the debris of the failed event. The fraudulent painting still stood on the stage, a testament to the disaster that had been averted. Mr. Pendleton gestured to a small private lounge off the main hall. "Please," he said to Sarah and Clara, "join me. You are no longer staff here. You are my honored guests." Hesitantly, Sarah and Clara followed him into a quiet room furnished with leather armchairs. Mr. Pendleton sat opposite them, not in an imposing way, but creating an atmosphere of intimacy. "I owe you a debt I can never truly repay," he said, looking at Clara, "but I must try. Tell me, what can I do for you?" "Anything you desire. A gift, a reward." He was thinking of money, of course. A trust fund for her education. A new house for her mother. He could secure their future for the rest of their lives. It was the simplest, easiest way to show his gratitude. Clara looked at her mother, then back at Mr. Pendleton. She thought for a moment. She wasn't thinking about toys or clothes. She was thinking about something else entirely. "Your wife?" she asked softly. She really loved art, didn't she? The question was so unexpected, so personal, that Mr. Pendleton was momentarily taken aback. The hardness in his face softened. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet, "she did. It was her whole world." "Did she have a favorite painter?" Clara asked. "Besides Leonardo," he said with a sad smile, "she loved the Dutch masters. Vermeer. He painted light. She said he didn't just paint light. He painted the feeling of a quiet morning. He used lead tin yellow," Clara said, her eyes lighting up. "It's a special color. It's how he made the light look so real. Nobody makes it anymore." The billionaire stared at her, astonished. In that moment, he realized that the reward this child wanted wasn't something he could buy, but something he could share. Knowledge. Passion. The very things his wife had cherished. He had been trying to buy a trophy in his wife's name, when all along her real legacy was sitting right in front of him, in the heart and mind of this little girl. He stood up. "Come with me," he said. "Both of you." Mr. Pendleton led them not out to the street, but to a private elevator concealed behind a paneled wall. As they ascended, the distant noise of London faded, replaced by a gentle hum. "The auction house is for business," Mr. Pendleton explained, his voice softer in the confined space, "for events with men like Julian Croft. But my home, my gallery, that is for the soul." The elevator doors opened directly into the most magnificent apartment Clara had ever seen. It was a sprawling penthouse with glass walls that offered a breathtaking panorama of the city skyline. But it wasn't the view that made Clara gasp. It was the art. The walls were lined not with bland modern decorations, but with masterpieces. A vibrant Monet water lily scene hung over a fireplace. A pensive portrait by Rembrandt occupied a place of honor. A delicate Degas sculpture of a dancer stood on a pedestal. It was a private museum, a sanctuary of beauty. "Eleanor collected all of this," Mr. Pendleton said softly, a flicker of pain and pride in his eyes. "Every piece has a story." He walked them into a room that was clearly a library and a study. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with art history volumes. In the center of the room, on a large, intricately woven Persian rug, were several deep leather armchairs and low tables, inviting quiet contemplation. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, pleasant scent of beeswax polish. To Clara, it smelled like her great-grandfather's study. It smelled like home. "She spent most of her time in here," Mr. Pendleton said, gesturing around the room. "Planning, researching. She was meticulous." He walked over to a small, elegant desk in the corner and picked up a checkbook. It was the solution of a billionaire. A simple transaction. Sarah's stomach tightened. The money would change their lives. It would mean an end to the constant worry. The second job, cleaning offices. The fear of falling behind. But somehow, after the conversation about Vermeer, it felt inadequate. It felt like a payment for a service rendered. And what Clara had done was so much more than that. Before Mr. Pendleton could write, Clara spoke, her voice pulling their attention to a small painting that hung in a place of honor over the desk. It was a simple, beautiful scene of a woman reading a letter by an open window. The light streaming in was so real it seemed warm. "That one is real," she said, her voice filled with quiet awe. The statement, so different from the one that had shattered the auction, hung in the quiet air of the library. Mr. Pendleton froze, his pen hovering over the check. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. "Oh, Clara, no, not now. Don't push your luck." Mr. Pendleton slowly put the checkbook down and walked back to her. His face was unreadable. "That is a Vermeer," he said. "The love letter." It was Eleanor's most prized possession. Clara nodded, not taking her eyes off the painting. "I know," she whispered. She pointed to a tiny detail on the tiled floor in the painting. "See there, the chip in the corner of the blue tile. He painted the flaw. My great-grandfather said that's how you know something is real. Because real things aren't perfect. Forgers are afraid of mistakes. But masters know that's where life is." Mr. Pendleton stared at the tiny chip tile, a detail he had looked at 1,000 times but never truly seen. He had cherished the painting for its value, for its fame, for the fact that his wife had loved it. Now this 10-year-old girl was showing him why she had loved it. She was giving him back a piece of his own wife's heart. He felt a sudden sharp pain, not of anger but of something else, a sense of being unmade. How much of what he thought was real was actually just a story he'd been told. Croft's Leonardo was a lie. This Vermeer, this little chip in the tile, was the truth. Instead of becoming angry, he felt a strange sense of liberation. Clara wasn't just exposing fakes. She was revealing truth. And the truth, he was beginning to understand, was more valuable than any artifact, any story, any amount of money. He let out a long, slow breath. And then, to Sarah's utter astonishment, he began to laugh. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a deep, hearty laugh that echoed through the vast library, a sound of genuine, unburdened amusement. In one afternoon, he said, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye, "You have saved me from a $300 million fraud and taught me more about my own wife's favorite painting than I've learned in 20 years. You, little girl, are the most expensive and most valuable guest I've ever had." He looked from Clara's serious face to Sarah's terrified one, and his laughter softened into a warm smile. "Do not worry, Mrs. Miller. Your daughter is not in trouble. She is a revelation." He turned back to his desk, but he did not pick up the checkbook. He pushed it aside. The idea of simply giving them money now seemed crass, almost insulting. It was what Julian Croft would have done. It was the language of transactions, not of gratitude. Clara deserved more. Her gift deserved more. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his tone shifting from amusement to serious purpose. "For both of you." He looked at Sarah. "I would like to offer you a position, not as a maid. I need a manager for this collection, an estate manager, someone to manage the staff, the preservation, the security. I don't want a traditional academic from a university. I want someone with integrity, someone who understands the value of truth." He paused. "I believe that person is you. You raised this remarkable child. You carry the legacy of Sergeant Jack Miller. I would pay you a generous salary, and I would provide you with a home here in one of the apartments in this building." Sarah was so stunned she couldn't speak. An estate manager, a home. It was a world away from scrubbing floors and worrying about rent. It was a life she had never dared to dream of. Then Mr. Pendleton turned to Clara. "And for you, young lady, my offer is different. I do not want to give you a reward. I want to give you a responsibility." He swept his arm, encompassing the entire library and the magnificent collection beyond it. "This will be your classroom and your playground. I want you to study every book, every painting in this collection. I want you to find the flaws. I want you to find the truths. I want you to help me see this all through your eyes." His own eyes gleamed with a new project, a new passion. "We will build a new legacy, one based not on price tags and auction house hype, but on verifiable truth. We will create a foundation in your great-grandfather's name, the Sergeant Jack Miller Foundation for Art Conservation. It will fund research. It will expose forgeries. It will teach others how to see what you see." He leaned forward, his voice filled with earnest, compelling energy. "I will give you all the resources you need. Tutors, access to experts, travel when you are older. In return, you will be my secret weapon, my personal curator of truth. What do you say?" Clara was speechless. To be let loose in this library, to be given the job of solving its mysteries, was the greatest adventure she could possibly imagine. It wasn't a gift of money that would be spent and gone. It was a gift of purpose. She looked at her mother. Sarah's face was a canvas of disbelief and dawning joy. The worry lines that seemed permanently etched around her eyes were gone, replaced by the sheen of unshed tears of happiness. She nodded at Clara, a silent permission, a shared understanding that their lives had just been irrevocably changed. Clara turned back to Mr. Pendleton. She didn't jump up and down or squeal with delight. She simply stood a little taller, a solemn look on her young face. She held out her hand, not like a child, but like an equal partner sealing a deal. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's a deal." The billionaire, amused and deeply moved, took her small hand in his. In the heart of his quiet library, surrounded by the ghosts of his wife's passion, he had nearly lost $300 million. But he had found something infinitely more precious. He had found truth. And it had come in the form of a 10-year-old girl with blonde hair, a faded blue dress, and a hero for a great-grandfather. The real story, he knew, was only just beginning. The days that followed were a blur of transformation for Sarah and Clara Miller. They moved from their cramped two-room flat in a noisy part of the city to a spacious sunlit apartment in the same luxurious building as Mr. Pendleton. It was a world of quiet corridors, uniformed doormen who tipped their hats and smiled, and windows that looked out over the green expanse of Hyde Park. For the first few nights, Clara would stand at her new bedroom window, watching the distant river of headlights flowing through the city, feeling as though she had woken up inside a dream. Sarah, true to her nature, adapted with quiet, determined grace. The title of estate manager initially felt like an ill-fitting coat, but Mr. Pendleton was a patient and thoughtful employer. He didn't just give her a job, he gave her the tools to succeed. He hired a discreet financial advisor to help her manage her new salary, and a tutor to school her in the finer points of art administration and conservation. Sarah absorbed it all with fierce intelligence that had long been underestimated. She organized the household staff, liaised with museum curators about loans from the Pendleton collection, and managed the complex security and insurance requirements with the same meticulous care she had once used to polish silver. The deep lines of worry that had been her constant companions for years began to soften. She started to smile more, a genuine, relaxed smile that made her look years younger. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. Clara's transformation was quieter but no less profound. The Pendleton penthouse became her universe. Arthur, as he now insisted she call him, was true to his word. He gave her an office, a small room adjoining the main library that he had stocked with art supplies, history books suitable for a budding scholar, and a state-of-the-art computer with access to international museum databases. Their days developed a comfortable and studious rhythm. In the mornings, a private tutor would come to teach Clara her regular school subjects, math, literature, science, but in the afternoons her real education began. Arthur would join her in the library and they would become detectives. He taught her about the business side of the art world, the murky waters of provenance, the complex dance of auctions, the importance of irrefutable documentation. In return, Clara taught him how to see. They would spend hours in front of a single painting armed with a magnifying glass and a copy of her great-grandfather's journal. Clara would point out the faintest crackle in the varnish, the almost invisible trace of a brush hair caught in the pigment, the subtle shift in color that revealed an artist's hesitation. She had an uncanny instinct, a gift inherited from Sergeant Jack Miller, for sensing the story an object wanted to tell. "Look here, Arthur," she would say, pointing to a dark corner in a 17th-century Dutch still life. The artist painted over something. The shadow is too thick and the paint is a slightly different texture. Arthur would call in his team. A portable X-ray machine would be brought in, and under its penetrating gaze, the ghost of a different painting would emerge. A portrait of a woman painted over centuries ago. They discovered that the still life was likely painted by a student over a discarded work by his master. The painting's value didn't diminish. It became richer, more complex. Its story was now one of art, history, and the quiet hidden life of a studio. Meanwhile, the fallout from the Ellington auction house disaster continued to send shockwaves through the art world. Julian Croft, facing utter ruin and a barrage of lawsuits from defrauded investors, had confessed everything. La Dama Silenciosa was part of a sophisticated forgery ring that had been operating for years, preying on wealthy, often grieving collectors who were more interested in a story than in due diligence. The trail led to a shadowy workshop in Belgium and implicated several other prominent dealers and appraisers. The scandal was a brutal but necessary cleansing of a corrupt corner of the market. Arthur, with Clara as his silent partner and inspiration, channeled his anger into action. The Sergeant Jack Miller Foundation for Art Conservation was officially established. Its mission was twofold: to fund the development of new scientific techniques for art authentication, and to provide educational resources to help collectors and small museums protect themselves from fraud. Arthur poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the foundation, turning a moment of personal humiliation into a global force for good. The foundation's board of directors was a who's who of the world's most respected museum directors, conservators, and art historians, including their friend Professor Alistair Davies. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after the auction, Arthur called Clara into the main library. He was standing beside a large flat object covered with a velvet cloth. His eyes held a special kind of excitement, the look of someone about to share a wonderful secret. "I have something for you," he said. "A gift and a first official assignment for my curator of truth." He pulled away the cloth. Underneath was not a painting but a large framed document. It was old. The paper yellowed with age, covered in elegant handwritten German script and adorned with official-looking stamps. At the bottom was a small black-and-white photograph of a familiar painting. "Vermeer's The Love Letter. What is it?" Clara asked, her eyes wide. "This," Arthur said, his voice filled with reverence, "is the original authenticated provenance for the Vermeer. It traces the painting's ownership all the way back to a private collection in Amsterdam in 1696. It's the painting's birth certificate, its life story." He then pointed to a smaller frame which he had set on a nearby table. It contained a single folded sheet of paper, and this, he said, is a letter. It arrived by courier this morning from a law firm in Germany. He handed it to Clara. The letter was from the estate of a recently deceased man. The man's grandfather had been a German officer during World War II. He had been stationed in the Netherlands and had been involved in the confiscation of art from Jewish families. The letter was a deathbed confession. It stated that while many famous works were recovered by the monuments men after the war, some, along with their documentation, were cleverly hidden. The officer had stolen the real Vermeer, replacing it with an almost perfect copy he had commissioned from none other than Erich Hoffmann, the forger whose dragonfly signature Clara had recognized. The real painting, the letter claimed, was still hidden, its location detailed in a sealed envelope to be opened only by the rightful heirs, should they ever be found. Clara felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She looked from the letter to the masterpiece hanging over the desk, the painting she had loved, the painting that had taught Arthur to see. "You mean," she whispered, her voice trembling, "the one, our Vermeer?" Arthur nodded slowly, his face grim. "The letter claims that the painting Eleanor and I bought, the painting that has hung in this house for 20 years, is a fake. Hoffmann, one of his greatest, most deceptive works." The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, the city hummed along, oblivious. But inside the library, the very foundation of Arthur Pendleton's world, of Clara's new life, had just cracked. The painting that had represented the ultimate truth, the piece that had launched their entire crusade against forgeries, was itself a lie. The irony was so profound, so cruel, it was almost suffocating. Arthur looked at Clara, his face a mixture of devastation and a strange, steely resolve. He had been fooled once by grief. He would not be fooled again. "The German lawyers want to send experts," he said. "The museum that claims ownership wants to send their curators. The world will be watching, but I don't trust their experts, not yet." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I trust you, Clara. I trust your eyes. I trust your great-grandfather's legacy. I want you to look at it. Look at it again. Forget the letters. Forget the lawyers. Forget everything. Just look at the painting and tell me. Tell me the truth." It was the ultimate test. Her first official assignment was to pass judgment on the very soul of the Pendleton collection, to potentially destroy the legacy of the woman who had, in a way, brought them all together. She was no longer just a girl who could spot a fake. She was the guardian of a truth that could shatter the man who had saved her. The weight of the world seemed to settle on Clara's small shoulders. The Vermeer, Eleanor's favorite painting, had been the bedrock of her new life. It was the symbol of authenticity, the silent teacher that had guided her and Arthur. Now it was accused. It hung over the desk, the woman by the window still reading her letter, the light still streaming in, a perfect picture of peace, while the room around it was filled with a silent gathering storm. Sarah, hearing the gravity in their voices, had come to the library doorway. She saw the letter, the grim look on Arthur's face, and the immense burden that had just been placed on her daughter. Her first instinct was to rush in, to protect Clara, to tell Arthur it was too much to ask of a child. But then she saw the look on Clara's face. The fear was there, yes, but underneath it was a quiet, focused intensity. This was not a game anymore. This was the work. This was the legacy of Sergeant Jack Miller coming to life. For the next 2 days, the library was sealed. It became Clara's laboratory and sanctuary. Arthur had every piece of equipment from the newly formed foundation delivered to the penthouse. High-resolution digital cameras, an infrared reflectography scanner, an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer to analyze the elemental composition of the pigments. A team of trusted technicians operated the equipment, but Clara directed them. She started not with the science but with her eyes. For hours, she simply sat in front of the painting just looking. She looked until the figures and the story dissolved, and all that was left was color and texture and light. She sketched the composition in a notebook, trying to feel the rhythm of the artist's hand. She read her great-grandfather's notes on Vermeer, his descriptions of the master's unique pointillist-like application of paint, the way he built up layers of color to create an unparalleled sense of luminosity. Then she turned to the science. The technicians, men and women with advanced degrees, followed the quiet, precise instructions of the 11-year-old girl. They scanned the painting section by section. The images appeared on a large monitor, showing the world beneath the surface. Arthur sat in a chair in the corner of the room, watching, waiting. He didn't interfere. He had placed his faith in her and he would see it through to the end. He had already spoken to his lawyers. If the painting was a fake, he was prepared to do the right thing. To publicly acknowledge the fraud, to help find the rightful heirs, to lead the search for the real Vermeer. His reputation would suffer, but the truth, as Clara had taught him, was more important. The first results came from the infrared scan. Clara leaned forward, her eyes glued to the screen. Unlike the perfect sterile underdrawing of the fake Leonardo, the Vermeer was a hive of activity. The angle of the woman's head had been shifted slightly. The position of the lute hanging on the wall had been moved a fraction of an inch to the left. It was full of pentimenti. It was the work of a restless, creative mind, not a careful copyist. A small knot of tension in Clara's chest began to loosen. The artist was thinking, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. He was changing his mind. Next came the pigment analysis. The spectrometer hummed as it scanned the canvas, producing a graph of elemental signatures. They tested the vibrant reds, the earthy browns, and the deep shadows. Everything was consistent with pigments used in the 17th century. Then they focused on the most important color. The color of the light, the signature lead tin yellow. Clara held her breath as the machine analyzed the bright sun-drenched patch of wall next to the window. The graph on the screen flickered, then resolved into a clear set of peaks. It was unmistakable. Lead tin yellow, the chemical signature of the lost pigment. Erich Hoffmann, the forger, was a master, but his expertise was in pigments from the 19th and 20th centuries. He had never, in all his known forgeries, been able to perfectly replicate the unique luminous quality of lead tin yellow. He used a cadmium-based yellow which was a close match but chemically distinct. A wave of relief washed over Clara. "It's there," she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "The light is real." But something was still bothering her. The letter, the confession, it had been so specific, so certain. A dying man's last words. Why would he lie? Forgers were arrogant, her great-grandfather had written. They loved to leave a mark. The dragonfly was Hoffmann's mark. What if he had left a different kind of mark on this one? A mark designed not to be found for decades. She went back to the painting, her eyes scanning every inch. The chip in the tile, the folds of the dress, the woman's face, nothing. It was perfect. Too perfect? No. The pentimenti proved it wasn't. Her gaze fell upon the letter in the woman's hand. In the painting, the letter was mostly a blur of white paint, the writing illegible, a suggestion of words rather than the words themselves. It was a private moment, not meant for the viewer to read. "Can we get a microphotograph of the letter?" she asked the lead technician. "The highest magnification we can get." The technician focused a powerful microscopic lens on the tiny rectangle of white in the center of the painting. The image on the screen zoomed in past the cracks in the varnish, past the texture of the canvas until the individual strokes of paint were visible. The writing was just a series of delicate gray and black squiggles. Meaningless. "Wait," Clara said. "Go back, pan to the left edge of the paper." The image shifted and then she saw it. Hidden in the shadows where the woman's thumb held the paper, disguised as the faint, almost invisible lines of a watermark, were two tiny, meticulously painted letters. E.H. Erich Hoffmann. The room went cold. The scientific evidence, the underdrawing, the pigments all pointed to it being a real Vermeer. But there, hidden in plain sight, was the forger's signature. It was an impossible contradiction. A paradox painted onto canvas. Arthur stood up and walked over to the screen, staring at the tiny initials. A muscle twitched in his jaw. The confession was true. The painting was a fake, after all. The work of a genius, a masterpiece of deception that had fooled the world for over 70 years, but a fake nonetheless. Clara felt a lump in her throat. She had failed. The truth was not a clean, simple victory this time. It was a heartbreaking defeat. But her great-grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. Look for the artist's hand, Clara, not just his signature. She looked from the initials on the screen to the real painting on the wall. She looked at the light. The impossible living light that she knew with every fiber of her being was real. How could Hoffman have created that light? The machine had proved he couldn't have, and then like a key turning in a lock, it all made sense. He didn't paint the whole thing, Clara said, her voice trembling with the force of her discovery. Arthur turned to her, a look of confusion on his face. What are you talking about? Hoffman didn't forge the painting, Clara said, walking back to the original canvas, her eyes blazing with new understanding. He restored it. She explained her theory, the words tumbling out. The painting was real. It had been damaged during the war, perhaps mishandled, a part of it scraped or torn. The letter in the woman's hand. That was the point of damage. Hoffman, the master forger and a brilliant restorer, was commissioned to repair it. And in his arrogance, while repainting the tiny damaged section of the letter, he couldn't resist leaving his mark. His secret signature hidden forever inside the masterpiece. The German officer didn't understand the nuance. He only knew Hoffman had worked on the painting, and he assumed, or lied, that it was a full copy. The dying man's confession was not a lie, but a misunderstanding. A family legend that had grown more dramatic with time. The painting is real, Clara declared, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. Eleanor's Vermeer is real. Hoffman just signed his repair work. To prove it, she directed the technicians to take a microscopic sample. A pinprick of paint from the area of the initials and another from a different white section of the letter. The lab analysis would take a few hours, but Clara already knew what it would show. The sample with the initials would have trace elements of modern binders mixed with the 17th century pigments. The other sample would be pure. As they waited, the library was filled with a new kind of silence. Not of dread, but of quiet, hopeful anticipation. Arthur looked at the Vermeer, his Vermeer, Eleanor's Vermeer, and saw it with new eyes yet again. He saw its history, its journey through wars and lies, its scars and its survival. He saw the tiny chip in the tile and the secret signature of the forger, and he realized they were both the same thing. They were the marks of life, the proof of its authenticity. When the lab results came back, they confirmed Clara's theory completely. The painting was genuine. The initials were part of a small, localized restoration. Arthur Pendleton slowly walked over to Clara. He didn't bow this time. He knelt so that he was eye level with her. There were tears in his eyes, tears of relief and profound gratitude. Your great-grandfather was a hero, Clara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He saved art from the Nazis, but today you did something more. You saved a piece of history. You saved a piece of my heart. He stood and turned to Sarah, who was now weeping openly with pride and relief. The Sergeant Jack Miller Foundation has its first official finding, he announced. And our curator of truth, well, she is priceless. In the end, the truth was more complex and more beautiful than a simple story of fake or real. It was a story of survival, of a masterpiece that had been wounded, healed, and secretly signed by its enemy, only to have its true story revealed centuries later by the clear eyes of a 10-year-old girl. Arthur knew then that their work had only just begun. There were more stories to uncover, more truths to defend, and he had the best curator in the world to help him do it. Now listen, if you've made it this far in this story, you're exactly the kind of person I create these videos for. Someone who appreciates depth, who values truth, and who understands that the best stories are the ones that challenge us to see the world differently. That's why I need you to do something important right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I promise you, every story I bring to this channel is carefully crafted to give you that same sense of wonder and discovery you just experienced. Stories about hidden truths, extraordinary courage, and the power of knowledge. Stories that matter. And here's the thing, when you subscribe, you're not just supporting this channel. You're becoming part of a community that believes truth matters more than wealth, that integrity matters more than status, and that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. So go ahead, click that subscribe button right now. Leave me a comment telling me what moment in this story hit you the hardest. Was it when Clara first spoke up in Italian? Was it the revelation about the Vermeer? I read every single comment and I love hearing what resonates with you. And if you really want to help this channel grow and reach more people who appreciate these kinds of stories, hit that like button too. It makes a massive difference in helping others discover these videos. Because stories like Clara's, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, these are the stories that need to be told. These are the stories that remind us what's possible when we have the courage to speak truth, even when the whole world is telling us to stay silent. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for caring about stories that matter. And remember, just like Clara discovered, the truth isn't always obvious and it isn't always convenient, but it's always worth pursuing. I'll see you in the next story, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, keep questioning, keep searching, and keep believing that one voice, no matter how small, can change everything.